That weekend, I was completely on my own at my cabin-style house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't deep in the middle of nowhere. There were other homes scattered nearby, but they were far enough apart that you could easily go days without crossing paths with another person. No door-to-door visitors, no neighbors dropping by, just quiet. This was the kind of neighborhood people drove straight through without noticing it existed. If you weren't really paying attention, all you'd see was an endless wall of trees. And since it was winter, right after a heavy snowfall, the silence felt heavier than usual. Snow smothered everything, and the forest behind my house seemed thicker, darker, and more closed in than I remembered. Honestly, I didn't mind the solitude. The place was warm and inviting, huge windows, a stone fireplace, and that unmistakable cabin atmosphere. That peaceful isolation was the entire reason I chose to live there. The first night passed normally, at least until late. I stayed up in the living room watching YouTube, drifting in and out of sleep until around midnight. Eventually, I shut off the TV and made my way down the hall to my bedroom. It was a single-story house, and my room sat at the very end of the hallway. Like the rest of the home, it had massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining one wall, plus a sliding glass door that opened straight toward the woods. Given how private the property was, nothing but trees in every direction, it seemed reasonable on paper. Still, it could be unsettling. Catching my own reflection in the glass at night was enough to make my heart jump, like someone was standing outside watching me. But that night, it felt different. I turned off the lights and slid under the covers. Just as I started to relax, I heard it, a faint cracking sound coming from outside. Not the usual noises of the forest, not an animal, something else. This sound was heavier, like the snap of a thick branch being crushed under someone's weight. A few seconds passed, then it happened again. I pushed myself upright in bed and locked my eyes on the massive window. With the room lights off, the glass acted like a clear pane into the darkness outside. I watched for a solid half-minute before something shifted deep in the shadows between the tall pines. It wasn't a shape I could clearly define, just a sudden movement, a shadow sliding where it shouldn't have been. It was as if something leaned out from behind a tree, or leaned back into it. I honestly couldn't tell. And then everything went completely still. I stayed there, staring into the woods, my nerves tightening by the second. After a few long minutes, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. Even so, I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed, checked the sliding glass door to make sure it was locked, and climbed back under the covers. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every half-minute or so, I felt compelled to open my eyes and glance back toward the window. Each time there was nothing there. The next day felt wrong. Nothing specific happened, but there was this lingering sense that something was off. I couldn't shake it. All day, that subtle, crawling unease followed me. The feeling that someone was just out of sight, watching. I kept turning toward whatever window was behind me, almost expecting to catch a pair of eyes staring back. I never did, but the sensation refused to fade. When evening came and darkness settled in again, snow started falling once more. Strangely, that calmed me down a bit. It felt less likely that anyone would be wandering around in the cold, snowy woods, so I told myself to stop overthinking it. By around 10, I was back in the living room, bundled in a blanket, watching TV beside the fireplace. The glow from the screen lit most of the house, and I didn't even realize how dark it really was until I got up to grab a soda. As I walked down the main hallway, something caught my attention. The light in the far room, the small den lined with bookshelves, was off. I almost always left that light on. It gave the house a soft glow and kept it from feeling like a dark cave once the sun went down. Without a second thought, I walked over, switched it back on, grabbed my soda, and returned to the couch. I couldn't have been sitting there for more than a minute. I'd just unpaused the TV when I casually glanced over my shoulder. Nothing intentional, just a reflex. The light was off again. My stomach dropped, and it felt like all the blood drained from my face. I stood up and stepped partway into the hallway, just far enough to see the switch. It was flipped down. Someone hadn't just turned the light off, it had been physically switched. I froze, staring at it. Someone was in that room. Worse, it felt deliberate, like they wanted me to walk in there and check. I slowly backed away. My phone was still charging on the nightstand in my bedroom, and my car keys were hanging by the front door. I knew I needed both, and I needed to leave now. Keeping as quiet as I could, I slipped into the other hallway and into my bedroom. As I grabbed my phone, movement caught my eye in the glass. I looked up, and at first, I only noticed faint footprints pressed into the snow outside the window. Then my eyes followed the tracks. They led straight to a tall figure. A man stood only a few feet from the glass. His features were swallowed by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze locked onto me. I bolted back down the hallway toward the front door, snatching my keys, when I heard footsteps. Not just one set, but two sets of footsteps on the other side of the house. I threw the front door open and sprinted toward the side driveway where my car was parked. The moment I slid into the driver's seat, I saw him. The same figure bursting around the corner of the house and charging straight at me. I started the engine and tore off toward the main road. In the mirror, I caught one last glimpse of him standing in the driveway, motionless, watching as my car disappeared into the darkness. It took a little over half an hour for the police to reach my property. What they walked into was beyond disturbing. Several windows had been smashed in, and the inside of the house looked like it had been completely torn apart. Doors and cabinets were ripped clean off their hinges. Furniture was overturned. The walls were scarred with deep dents and tears. I told the officers I'd heard two people moving inside the house and had seen one man outside, but given the destruction, it was impossible to understand how they had managed to get in and stay hidden while I was home all day. I ended up living out of a hotel for weeks while repairs were made, and not long after, I put the house up for sale. What haunted me the most was the realization that multiple people had likely been watching me for who knows how long. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out in time still makes my stomach turn. Even now, I have recurring nightmares, me standing in that hallway, slowly approaching the darkened room, knowing something is waiting just beyond the doorway, just out of sight. My name's Noah. I'm 36 years old. Before I get into what happened, I need to explain how I ended up living where I do. A couple of years before all of this, my wife and I split up, only a few months after we'd bought a house together. It wasn't a messy breakup or anything dramatic. We didn't even finalize the divorce until months later, but that part isn't really important. What is important is the house itself. It was huge, honestly way bigger than we ever needed. The idea was that it would be something we'd grow into, kids someday, dogs running around, that kind of future. But once we went our separate ways, the house became my problem alone. I had to decide whether to sell it at a loss or just stay and make it work. I chose to stay. So for 2 full years it was just me in that place. I kept telling myself I'd eventually make use of all that space. Since I worked from home, I thought I'd set up a dedicated office, maybe turn another room into a workout space. Keep the bedroom separate so the house didn't feel so empty. At least, that was the plan. But plans are easy to make and hard to follow through on. Most of the house stayed untouched. Big, hollow, unused rooms collecting dust. If you opened a random door, chances were you'd find nothing inside. Just an empty space that hadn't been stepped into for months. There were entire sections of the house I avoided without even realizing it. I didn't mind the quiet most of the time, but every now and then, that feeling would creep in. That uncomfortable awareness of being completely alone in a massive, empty house. Between that and the general loneliness, I finally decided to do something I'd been thinking about for years. I decided to adopt a dog. That decision is where everything really began. I found an 8-month-old puppy at a shelter named Piper. She was a small beagle, full of energy. The shelter was about 3 hours away, so by the time I got off work, made the drive and headed back home with her, it was already around 8 p.m. When we arrived, I let her run around the yard for a bit, then brought her inside so she could check out her new home. At the shelter, Piper had been bouncing off the walls, happy, excited, curious. Even during the car ride, she was playful and calm. But the moment she stepped inside my house, something changed. She stopped. Her energy vanished, and she suddenly became very, very timid. At the time, I figured she was just overwhelmed. New place, new smells, new person. Of course, she was nervous. I didn't read too much into it. I gave her some space, sat down on the couch, and let her do her thing. She wandered around for maybe a couple of minutes before suddenly hopping up beside me, curling tightly into my lap. There was something about it that felt like fear, like she was trying to hide from something. But again, I brushed it off. Everything about her behavior could be explained by a puppy adjusting to a brand new home. Later that night, I brought her upstairs and we went to bed. By morning, things seemed noticeably better. She stayed close while I made coffee and breakfast, then followed me into my office and settled beneath my desk while I worked. A few hours passed quietly until she stood up. She walked toward the doorway and stopped halfway into the hall, her body stiff, ears up, completely focused on something I couldn't see. After a moment, she stepped fully into the hallway. I heard her nails clicking against the floor as she moved away, heading toward the stairs. I assumed she was finally getting comfortable enough to explore the house, so I didn't stop her. I went back to work. About 10 minutes later, the calm shattered. She started barking, loud, frantic, non-stop, from somewhere downstairs. I shot up from my chair and rushed into the hallway, then down the stairs, her barking echoing through the house in every direction. The sound bounced off the walls so much that I couldn't even tell which room she was in. I kept calling her name, checking room after room, until I finally found her. Piper was standing in the center of one of the empty downstairs rooms. Not moving, just planted there, staring straight at the wall, barking. The moment she noticed me, she rushed over and pressed herself against my leg. Her tail was tucked, and she kept glancing back at the room like she didn't want to turn her back on it. I stepped inside and looked around, trying to figure out what she could have been reacting to. There was nothing. The room was completely empty. I scooped her up, spoke softly to calm her down, and shut the door behind us. I carried her back upstairs to my office, set her down, and after a few minutes, things settled. I went back to work, and for the rest of the day, nothing else unusual happened. After I logged off, I took her for a walk around the neighborhood. We spent the evening on the couch watching TV, then headed upstairs and went to bed around 10. And that's when it happened. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't wake up to a sound or a bang or anything like that. It was more like a sensation. Something just pulled me out of sleep. I sat up and immediately saw Piper standing at the bedroom door. Her ears were perked straight up, her body stiff, and her eyes locked onto the small crack between the door and the frame. I said her name, quietly at first, then louder. She didn't even flinch. And for some reason I still can't explain, I laid back down and went right back to sleep. Even now, thinking about it, that feels insane. At the time, I honestly convinced myself she was just uneasy in a new environment. When morning came, everything seemed normal again. Piper was curled up on the bed with me, acting completely fine. No nervousness, no strange behavior. I got ready for the day, went downstairs, let her outside, and went through my usual morning routine. Once she came back in, we both headed upstairs to my office. Just like before, she settled down underneath my desk while I worked. Every so often, I leaned down to check on her. Each time she was asleep, so I didn't think anything of it and kept working. It wasn't until close to 6 in the evening, when I was wrapping up for the day and the sunlight was almost gone, that I glanced under the desk again. She wasn't there. I looked around the room, thinking maybe she'd moved, but she was gone. She must have slipped out without me noticing. I shut my laptop and stepped into the hallway, calling her name as I went. Nothing. No footsteps. No barking. No movement at all. The house felt unnaturally quiet. "Piper?" I called again. My voice echoed back at me through the empty rooms. That's when a wave of unease hit me. I started down the hallway and headed for the stairs, my chest tightening with every step. There was no sign of her anywhere. The silence was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I turned down the next hallway, the one that led to the empty room where I'd found her the day before. As I got closer, something caught my attention. The door wasn't fully shut. It was slightly open. I was sure I'd closed it. I pushed the door the rest of the way open. Piper was in the far corner of the room, sitting low to the ground, shaking. She was facing me, eyes wide, like she was bracing for something. She looked absolutely terrified, like there was someone else in the house with us. A sudden instinct told me not to move forward. I turned around instead, and down the hallway, near the stairs, I caught the briefest glimpse of a figure, watching me. I stumbled backward into the room and slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as my hands would let me. Then I moved toward Piper. Moments later, I heard it, slow, careful footsteps approaching from the hallway. Whoever it was stopped right on the other side of the door. Piper started letting out these soft, broken whimpers from the corner, her eyes glued to the door. I couldn't even bring myself to step closer to her. I just stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, waiting for whatever was about to happen. The person on the other side didn't do anything at first. They just stood there. That silence was almost worse than noise. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard them turn and walk away, their footsteps fading back down the hallway. What terrified me most was how calm it sounded. They weren't rushing. They weren't panicking. It felt like they were completely in control, like this was all deliberate, like they'd come there for a reason, and that thought alone made my stomach drop. After that, there was nothing, no more sounds. I think I stayed in that room with Piper for at least half an hour. I wanted to move, to do something, but my body just wouldn't cooperate. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, I peered into the dark hallway. At the very end, I could see the front door standing wide open. I took that as a sign, hopefully, that whoever had been inside was gone. I bolted upstairs to grab my phone and call the police. On the way, I noticed several doors standing open, doors I knew for a fact I always kept shut. The second I had my phone, I rushed back downstairs and locked myself back in the room with Piper. I stayed there, holding onto her until the police arrived. They searched the house from top to bottom and even checked the land around it for several acres, but they didn't find anyone. There was no trace of the intruder anywhere. They didn't find the person, but they did find proof that someone had been living in my house. Upstairs, in a room right next to my office, officers discovered a pile of random belongings. Nothing organized, nothing that made sense for a guest. It looked like someone had been secretly staying there, possibly for months. What made it even worse was realizing how they'd done it. The closet in that room showed signs of regular use, like they'd been sleeping in there during the day, hidden, away so I wouldn't hear or notice them, and then moving around the house at night, slipping in and out when I was asleep. That realization made my blood run cold. Suddenly, everything clicked. Bringing Piper home must have changed everything. She could probably sense that we weren't alone. It made me think back to that night when I woke up and saw her frozen at the bedroom door, staring into the crack. He could have been right outside, walking through the hallway while I slept. And the room where she'd been barking at the wall? That wasn't random either. It was directly beneath the room the intruder had been using as a hiding spot. She may have heard movement above her, something I was completely oblivious to. When it was all over, I didn't hesitate. That house was done. I put it up for sale and moved into a smaller place. And of course Piper came with me. She's been the best companion I could have ever asked for. Since the move, she's been just as joyful and energetic as she was the day. I met her at the shelter, no fear, no anxiety, nothing like before. Still, the one thing that sticks with me is that they never found the person. I know the chances are slim, but part of me can't shake the thought that they could come back. Some things like that, you just don't forget. I was 18 and still living at home, but old enough that my parents could leave me alone without worrying. This was one of those times. They were going to be gone for a couple of days. Our house wasn't anything fancy, just a typical suburban home. On days like this, my routine was simple. I'd mostly lounge around, watch TV, or play video games. I didn't have my own car yet, so unless I was willing to walk half an hour for fast food, I had zero reason to leave the house. That morning, I spent a few hours just lying in bed, flipping through channels, until I finally dragged myself up and headed downstairs to the kitchen. Almost as soon as I started making breakfast, my phone buzzed with a text from my friend. I figured he was just waiting for me to get online, so I ignored it for a minute and kept cooking. But when I finally opened the message, it threw me off. He asked, "Who's the guy outside your house?" I froze. That caught me completely off guard. I texted back, "What?" and peered out the front window, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, just the usual quiet neighborhood. His house is right across from mine, so I even checked there. He wasn't anywhere in sight. I was puzzled, but figured maybe he was joking. He had a habit of sending weird stuff to mess with me, so I called him to see what he was up to. The moment he picked up, I realized this wasn't a joke. He sounded serious, not playful at all. He sounded completely serious. He told me he genuinely saw some random guy outside my house, someone he'd never seen before, and the only reason he even brought it up was because the guy looked like he was trying to peer through my windows. That alone was unsettling, but since the guy was gone by then, and neither of us had any idea who he was or what he wanted, we eventually brushed it off. We hopped on a Discord call and started playing video games like usual. We stayed online for hours. The only time I left my room was once, just to go downstairs and refill my water. While I was down there, I glanced out the front window again, half expecting to see someone, but the street was still empty. We finally got off the call around 5 or 6 in the evening. By then it was already dark outside, and I remember realizing how fast the day had slipped by. I got up and headed downstairs. I started throwing together a quick dinner, already thinking I'd probably just spend the rest of the night watching TV in my room. But as I stood there cooking, something caught my attention. A shadow suddenly moved across the wall in front of me. I spun around instantly. There was nothing there. The living room was completely still, nothing out of place. That's when my eyes landed on the window. I walked over and looked outside. Everything was dark and quiet. I didn't see anyone. Still, the thought that someone might have been standing out there, watching me, sent a chill through my body. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it could have been headlights from a passing car or something harmless. I convinced myself it was nothing. I finished making my food, took it upstairs, and spent the rest of the night lying in bed watching TV. I stayed up there for at least an hour, maybe longer, barely paying attention to what was playing on the TV. As the night went on and my room got darker, it hit me that I hadn't turned on a single light upstairs. The only thing lighting the room was the glow from the screen. I kept catching myself staring at the small gap beneath my bedroom door, noticing how the hallway outside was completely black. Normally, that wouldn't have bothered me at all, but that night, something about it felt wrong. Eventually, I paused the show and decided to go downstairs for a snack, though really, it was just an excuse to walk around, turn on all the lights and shake off the uneasy feeling. The second I opened my bedroom door, that feeling intensified. The house felt unnaturally quiet, and the hallway was swallowed in darkness. I reached out and flipped the light on, revealing nothing but an empty hall. I remember feeling kind of stupid, even irritated with myself for letting it get to me before heading downstairs. Before grabbing anything to eat, I checked the windows. The paranoia I was feeling was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It was intense and hard to ignore. I left all the downstairs lights on too, even though I knew I wasn't coming back down again before bed, just so I wouldn't have to think about the house being pitch black. As I started walking back upstairs, I suddenly stopped halfway up. I thought I heard something, almost like my footsteps echoing through the house, but it sounded off. The house had never made noises like that before. I took a few steps back down, then climbed again, but the sound didn't repeat. I stood there frozen for a moment, replaying the sound in my head over and over. My eyes widened, my heart started pounding, and suddenly instinct took over. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed myself into my room, locked the door, and immediately called the police. I was almost certain, like 9% sure, that what I'd heard wasn't my own footsteps. It sounded like someone else in the house, matching my steps perfectly, as if they were copying my movements so I wouldn't notice them coming up behind me. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. That was exactly what it was. While waiting for the police to arrive, I called my friend and asked if he could see anything from his house. At first he said no, but he stayed on the phone with me and walked over to his front window to look around. A couple minutes later, his tone suddenly changed. He said, "Oh shit," and told me he could see someone climbing out of a window on the side of my house and sprinting toward the trees. He said it looked like the same guy he'd seen earlier that day. I couldn't even speak for a full minute. I was terrified, not just because someone had been there, but because my gut feeling that I wasn't alone had been right. When the police arrived, I stood outside with them while they searched the house and checked the area. My friend came over too and gave his statement. In the end, there wasn't much they could do, beyond saying they'd keep an eye out and follow up if any leads came up. They did mention something that made things even worse. A similar incident had happened a few weeks earlier in a nearby neighborhood. Another kid had been home alone, and some guy had been lurking outside before approaching the window and trying to convince the kid to let him inside. In both situations, no one really knew what his intentions were. Kidnapping seemed like the obvious possibility, but he didn't appear to have a car, and dragging someone out of a house by force didn't seem realistic to me. To this day, I don't know what would have happened that night if things had gone differently. I never got answers. All I know is that whoever that guy was, he was never caught, and he's probably still out there, quietly watching someone who has no idea they're being stalked.